Good evening. It is wonderful to be here with you, the members of the CMA, and I thank you for taking time to be here to grow in your faith and the practice of medicine. Some of you may already be aware that Denver is home to one of two headquarters for the group Compassion and Choices, formerly known as the Hemlock Society. This evening, I want to spend my time with you speaking about the effort to legalize physician-assisted suicide in our state, as this issue will be front and center in Colorado in 2015. Last week, I learned that Compassion and Choices has hired a political lobbyist and a public relations firm to continue their push to make euthanasia legal in our state. If you have heard the story of Brittany Maynard, the 29-year-old newlywed with terminal brain cancer who took her life on November 2nd, then you have already experienced the first wave of publicity and marketing being organized by this group. On her website, she had over 5 million hits, and with that, people who were very supportive of her. Last Friday, we learned that the Colorado Democratic State Representatives, Lois Court of Denver and Joanne Ganal of Fort Collins, will be introducing a physician-assisted suicide bill in the legislative session that starts this coming January. The practice of assisted suicide is not something new, but what is new is the effort to legalize it and rationalize it as compassion. As physician and healthcare workers, you are on the front lines of this battle, which makes it vital that you understand why assisted suicide is evil, disguised as compassion, and why it is sinful. To help you to grow in your understanding of the questions that the assisted suicide debate presents, I will focus my remarks on the moral, medical, and mercy aspects of the discussion. This past Saturday, Pope Francis directly addressed the moral component of assisted suicide at a meeting with Italian Catholic doctors. He said, "In ancient thought and modern thought, the word kill means the same thing. The same evaluation applies to euthanasia. We all know that with so many old people, in this culture of waste, there is this hidden euthanasia." The Catechism of the Catholic Church gives a similar analysis on the matter. Whatever its motives and means, direct euthanasia consists in putting an end to the lives of handicapped, sick, or dying persons. It is morally unacceptable. Thus, an act or omission which of itself or by intention causes death in order to eliminate suffering constitutes a murder, gravely contrary to the dignity of the human person and to the respect due to the living God, his Creator. Pope Francis also touched on how assisted suicide involves a sin against God the Creator. He described it as telling God, "I will make the end of my life to be as I want it." This is an act of pride that echoes Adam and Eve's disobedience and lack of trust in God the Father in the Garden of Eden. They failed to trust that God had a plan of goodness for them and decided to seize control from him, abusing their free will and their dignity as human persons. In the coming year, you will likely hear arguments that aim to exonerate medical providers and remove physician from the phrase physician-assisted suicide. The aim of this is simple. It is an attempt to frame the argument of euthanasia as a matter of personal choice as something that only involves the person suffering from a disease and no one else. The only outcome of someone taking their life, advocates of euthanasia will say, will be the end of their suffering. God, society, friends, and possibly even families will not be a part of the discussion. It will be described in terms that make it a harmless act of compassion. But we do not live in a moral and spiritual vacuum. Our actions have concrete consequences for ourselves and others. This brings me to how legalizing physician-assisted suicide would radically change medical care. Contrary to the arguments put forth by assisted suicide advocates, anyone who has been involved in providing medical care knows that they are a part of life and death decisions. It is not possible to end a person's life before their time without some sort of medical intervention, even if it is as simple as prescribing a lethal dose of medicine. As all of you know, every health care provider has a duty to do no harm. This obligation has its roots in the Hippocratic Oath, which is worth recalling. The regimen I adopt shall be for the benefit of my patients, according to my ability and judgment, and not for their hurt or for any wrong. I will give no deadly drug to any, though it may be asked of me, nor will I counsel such, and especially I will not aid a woman to procure abortion. That is the 400 BC version, written by Hippocrates. Medical professionals are called to compassionately treat their terminally ill patients with the medical training and resources they have available to ensure that patients have the comfort and dignity they deserve at the end of their lives. In the Hippocratic Oath, the dignity of the human person and human life is recognized, both at its beginning and at its end. We live in much different times. We should not be naive about the efforts being made to change the fundamental principles underlying the practice of medicine. This can be seen in the modern-day changes that have been made to the Hippocratic Oath that many of you are already aware of. According to the logic of compassion and choices, and others in favor of legalizing euthanasia, an individual's so-called right to die trumps the conscience rights of physicians, pharmacists, and medical health care providers. We have already seen this type of trumping in the health and human service mandates and in the discussion around abortion for the past 40-plus years. This kind of societal change would result in a culture that more strongly embraces self-centered, autonomous living, disregard for the common good, and a promotion of a culture of death. When the weak and suffering are removed from a society, opportunities for loving, sacrificing, and caring for those in need decrease, and society becomes more self-centered. To use an analogy, our charitable muscles atrophy when suffering is seen as something to be avoided at all costs. A culture that shuns the sick and suffering becomes even more a throwaway culture that Pope Francis consistently warns us about. Those of you who have been involved in hospice care or treating those who are acutely ill are familiar with the term quality of life, which has been hijacked by some people to promote euthanasia. In the modern medical world, This idea is often limited to a person's financial and physical well-being. In his speech to the Italian Doctors Association, Pope Francis noted that the modern assessment of a patient's quality of life forgets other more profound dimensions of existence, interpersonal, spiritual, and religious. In fact, he stated, in the light of faith and right reason, human life is always sacred and always of quality. There is no human life that is more sacred than another. Every human life is sacred. For this reason, if medical providers truly want to alleviate pain, they should engage in a dialogue with faith. This leads me to my thoughts on the importance of mercy in the debate about physician-assisted suicide. Those of you who followed the story of Brittany Maynard heard her talk about wanting to end her life on her own terms. My dream, she said in an October 24 statement, is that every terminally ill American has access to the choice to die on their own terms with dignity. But contrary to the claims of assisted suicide activists, ending one's life by seizing it from God's hands is an affront to one's dignity. Instead, patients who are suffering need meaning. It is an act of mercy to help those who are suffering to know and experience that it has a purpose. When my own mother was dying, I would fly back and forth from home to home and would go from between Denver and Los Angeles every 2 weeks for almost 4 months. With her, the last 3 weeks of her suffering with cancer, I often refer to it as a school of charity. It taught me what it meant to get up every 2 hours in the middle of the night to turn somebody, to make sure they did not have bed sores, to make sure that she had not died, and to see if she was comfortable. She always was comfortable. But for us, her children, my 2 sisters and myself, and for those who helped to care for us, for her, it taught us the meaning of love, of being self-sacrificing for the sake of our mother who brought us into the world. Some of you might have read the famous psychiatrist, Dr. Viktor Frankl's best-selling book, Man's Search for Meaning, which details his experience of living in 4 different Nazi concentration camps before being freed. His book was so popular that it sold 10 million copies by the time he died in 1997. He attributed this to the fact that the search for meaning in life is a question that burns under the fingernails. As he explained in the 1993 preface to his book, I had simply wanted to convey to the reader, by way of a concrete example, that life holds a potential meaning under any conditions, even the most miserable. And I thought that if the point were demonstrated in a situation as extreme as that in a concentration camp, my book might gain a hearing. What follows in Man's Search for Meaning is a description of how Frankl and his fellow prisoners coped with the horrendous conditions of Nazi camps. If you have not read the book, I encourage you to read it. He found that those inmates who had a sense of purpose and were able to maintain hope throughout the ordeals they endured were able to survive. But those who pinned their hopes on being rescued by the Allies before Christmas or some other future goal declined mentally and physically once it failed to materialize. Frankl recalled one block warden who was a well-known composer before his imprisonment. One day he approached the psychiatrist and told him about a strange dream he had had, in which a voice said that he could ask a question about anything and it would be answered. The composer asked when he would be freed, and the voice told him it would happen on March 30th. When the warden told me about his dream, he was still full of hope, convinced that the voice of his dream would be right. But as the promised day drew near, the war news which reached our camp made it appear very unlikely that we would be freed on the promised date. On March 29th, he suddenly became ill and ran a high temperature. On March 30th, the day his prophecy had told him that the war and suffering would be over for him, he became delirious and lost consciousness. On March 31st, he was dead. To all outward appearances, he died of typhus. Those who are faced with a terminal illness are presented with a decision of whether they will rise to the occasion and retain their human dignity despite the suffering, or become the victim of their suffering. St. John Paul II, who was no stranger to suffering, offered a similar insight about the nature of suffering in his 1984 apostolic letter, Salvifici Doloris. Suffering, as it were, contains a special call to the virtue which man must exercise on his own part. And this is the virtue of perseverance, in bearing whatever disturbs and causes harm. In doing this, the individual unleashes hope, which maintains in him the conviction that suffering will not get the better of him, that it will not deprive him of his dignity as a human being, a dignity linked to awareness of the meaning of life. The more he shares this love, man discovers himself more and more fully in suffering. He rediscovers the soul, which he thought he had lost because of suffering. One has only to look at the life of Pope St. John Paul the Great to understand and to see how he lived the virtue of perseverance in his own suffering, especially in the last 3 years of his life and the last 6 months. Analyzing his experience and that of his fellow Jews in the concentration camp, Viktor Frankl determined that any man can, even under such circumstances, decide what shall become of him, mentally and spiritually. He remembered how some of his fellow prisoners bore witness to the fact that the last inner freedom cannot be lost. It can be said that they were worthy of their sufferings. The way they bore their suffering was a genuine inner achievement. It is this spiritual freedom, which cannot be taken away, that makes life meaningful and purposeful. In Salvifici Doloris, St. John Paul II provides a deeper level of meaning that is present in suffering for Christians. Because suffering is able to refine a person's virtues, if they refuse to passively accept it, it has a creative character. As doctors and medical care providers, you are present at a privileged moment in your patients' lives. And because of that, you should not be surprised if Christ desires you to serve as his messenger of what St. John Paul called the gospel of suffering. This gospel is the news that Jesus took suffering, which is an experience of evil, and made it the firmest basis of the definitive good, namely the good of eternal salvation. By turning suffering into the means of our salvation and inviting people to unite their suffering with his, Christ also gave meaning to suffering that was previously senseless. Gradually, St. John Paul II writes, as the individual takes up his cross, spiritually uniting himself to the cross of Christ, the salvific meaning of suffering is revealed before him. He does not discover this meaning as his own human level, but at the level of the suffering of Christ. It is then that man finds in his suffering interior peace and even spiritual joy. Paradoxically, man can discover in suffering a new dimension of his entire life and vocation, writes St. John Paul. In this dimension, even though his body is gravely ill, or perhaps totally incapacitated, the suffering person can reach a maturity and spiritual greatness which offers a touching lesson to those who are healthy and normal. As the entire world kept its eyes fixed on Rome at the end of March and beginning of April, back in 2005, when St. John Paul was dying, it became evident both his joy and his suffering, his peace, and he was one who taught the entire world a lesson of what it means to suffer and to suffer with Christ. There was a peace about him and a confidence in faith that the last words that he spoke was, I want to go to the house of the Father. He was confident in eternal life. He was confident in the promises of Jesus, and he kept his eyes fixed on the love of the Father. In closing, I want to address how you, as Catholic medical providers, should understand the terms mercy and compassion, and how you can make mercy a part of your medical care. The public relations campaign that will be rolled out by pro-assisted suicide groups brands their response to suffering as compassionate and dignified solution. However, as Pope Francis warned this past week, this is a false compassion. The Christian response is to accompany those who are suffering as good Samaritans. He approached the man assaulted by thieves, looked on him with mercy, and gave him concrete help. In doing so, we are able to give of ourselves, opening up our hearts to love. St. John Paul reflected on this experience by saying, following the parable of the gospel, we could say that suffering, which is present under so many different forms in our human world, is also present in order to unleash love in the human person. That unselfish gift of one's eye on behalf of other people, especially those who suffer. The world of human suffering unceasingly calls for, so to speak, another world, the world of human love. And in a certain sense, man owes to suffering that unselfish love which stirs in his heart and actions. This unleashing of love within our families, medical practices, churches, and society is the antidote to physician-assisted suicide. Physician-assisted suicide will become more accepted in our culture to the degree that society becomes more closed off to selfless acts of love and more focused on self-centered living. It seems to me that we are standing at a crossroads. People need meaning. They need to hear that their suffering has meaning and truth, and has been redeemed by Christ, and that it can give birth to their own eternal life. It is Jesus Christ who they need to encounter. Pope Francis acknowledged in his speech to the Italian Doctors Association that challenging the culture of death and selfishness will sometimes require choices that are courageous and go against the current, which in particular circumstances may become points of conscientious objection. Since it was announced on November 14th that a bill will be introduced in the Colorado legislature, the Colorado Catholic Conference has received many calls from people asking how can they help. I urge you, my dearest friends, to become involved in the debate. The best way for you as medical professionals to help is to recruit those who would be impacted by assisted suicide being legalized, or if you are working in an area that will be affected, to testify yourself. Any one of you who is interested should contact Jenny Kraska at the Colorado Catholic Conference. She will be speaking to you in January, but she also needs help in preparing for this battle, because it will be a battle. Furthermore, we must reach out to Catholics on both sides of the aisle and to all people of goodwill on both sides of the aisle, and encourage them to live their faith and their values, to promote a culture of life, and not to be tempted by faithfulness to their party's platform rather than the truth of the dignity of the human person from the moment of conception until natural death. A pagan culture over 2,400 years ago recognized that dignity, and our culture has lost it with the manipulation of truth, of goodness, and compassion. We live in a time and a culture that has listened more to the father of lies than to the truth. It is essential that we bring the truth back in to public discourse. You can also prepare yourself to counter the arguments being made by euthanasia activists by reading and reflecting on St. John Paul II's beautiful letter on suffering. I encourage you to take to heart his gospel of suffering and make it a part of your medical practice. I encourage you to take time to read that letter. Also, you are able to find the talk that Pope Francis gave to the doctors on the internet. Do not be afraid to give the mercy of accompaniment and meaning to your patients. God has given us a beautiful and life-giving teaching on the experience of suffering, his Son, Jesus Christ, who gave of himself completely and had, throughout his ministry, experienced suffering at different times, whether it be in the rejection of his family, whether it be in those who ridiculed him, whether it be in the final week of his life and the final day of his life. But he makes an eternal difference. I pray, my dearest sisters and brothers, that God may bless you in your efforts to not only do no harm, as Hippocrates spoke of, but also to do the great good that Jesus Christ spoke of in the gospel, and to promote a culture of life. Thank you.